Now let's talk about the American West in the years during and after Reconstruction. So I want to talk about the ways that the West was transformed by people and animals and the work that they did there. So in order to do that, I'm going to use buffalo or bison as my example, and I'm going to use it in 5 different ways. So the American bison or buffalo was once a common grazing animal, ranging over much of North America. It once grazed well east of the Mississippi River and west of the Rocky Mountains. In the middle of the 19th century, there may have been 10 million buffalo in the Great Plains between West Texas and the Canadian border. Buffalo, or American bison, was once a common grazing animal. Okay? And they were a key element of the short grass prairies of the Great Plains. Buffalo both thrived in these vast grasslands and helped maintain them. The plains grasses, perennials with deep root systems, benefited from buffalo grazing habits. Buffalo moved rather quickly, grazing lightly. Buffalo have small hooves, and these punctured tiny holes in the prairie, aerating the soil and allowing rainfall to penetrate. In winter, buffalo took refuge along the stream bottoms, which are not common in the plains. It was this winter habitat, not summer habitats, that was the limiting factor. Anglo-Americans dealt with buffalo in very different ways than Native Americans. Native Americans hunted buffalo from horseback with a bow and arrow. This was very hard to do. Surviving Native American drawings, like this one, and paintings by white observers illustrate the danger and hard work in hunting buffalo from horseback. The hardest part of exchanging and trading buffalo hides was not killing the buffalo, but preparing the skins. So this was women's work for nomadic tribes. It was hard for Native Americans to transport buffalo hides because they're heavy. Buffaloes are large animals. These facts both limited the number of animals that Indians killed and gave Indians good reasons to use all of the animals they killed. So Plains Indians followed the herds and lived off of them, drying some of the meat for winter. Their societies were adapted to buffalo, and their conflicts were largely over buffalo. Indians were at war on the plains, and these wars were exacerbated by early 19th century declines in bison population. These declines were contributed to diseases from cattle in Spanish Texas and New Mexico. So that's a little bit of a background on buffalo. So the first view of buffaloes in the West is buffalo as a business opportunity. Buffalo hunters were also small businessmen. They see buffalo as a business opportunity. The buffalo robe is the fleece blanket of today. Think of it as a animal product snuggie, if you will. So buffalo hunters invest in tools and employ people to engage in an industrial hunt. They begin turning these wild animals into commodities. Hunters only take the hides, leaving everything else behind. So at the time, estimates were that 3 to 5 buffalo were slaughtered for every hide brought to market. These hunters left buffalo corpses stinking and rotting in the sun all over the plains. Hide hunters took 4.3 million buffalo in the southern plains between 1870 and 1873, putting an end to the southern herd. This is an example of the destructive creativity of the industrial economy and its machines. The second view is buffalo and industrial technology. So I want to talk about the Sharps Big 50, which you can, if you can see the caption on this slide, you can see it says, "Note the Sharps Big 50, that's the gun." So the Sharps Big 50 is an ex-Civil War military technology, and this big rifle makes killing buffalo on this scale possible. So a good hunter could stand downwind and kill off about 30 to 40 buffalo without the herd noticing, because buffalo have bad eyesight. Another part of industrial technology that buffalo participated in after being hunted and killed was railroads. Railroads make it possible to get large numbers of buffalo hides to market. right? Remember, they're heavy. They're hard to carry. So buffalo hides are transported on trains. They're transported on vehicles with steam engines, and they're used in factories and in those engines themselves. So buffalo hides are turned into leather. And this leather is used in belts and pulleys in new industrial factories. So belts and pulleys connect steam engines to machinery. So now, due to this use of this nature from the West, animals and nature is now in the machines that convert nature to commodity, which is kind of crazy. So steam engines that power things in factories that make buffalo robes, for example, those steam engines, the belts on them are made from leather that come from these buffalo. So buffalo parts are being used in machines that turn buffalo into commodities for people to buy. And there is a big old pile of buffalo skulls. You can see the men there for some scale, so it's a really, really tall pile. So the third view of buffalo is buffalo and Indian wars. So the major obstacle to buffalo hunters finishing off the buffalo herds were the Native Americans who depended on them. There was already fierce competition for buffalo among the tribes, in which particular tribes gained dominance over other groups. So during this time, we see some of the first stages of Indian removal by Americans in the Western territories. So before the West could be settled by native foreign Americans and Europeans, Native Americans who inhabited the West would have to be convinced to remove or be contained or be forcibly removed. So in 1865, roughly 250,000 Native Americans lived west of the Mississippi, 2/3 in the Great Plains. And keep in mind, some of these groups had already been removed multiple times from areas further east. So Great Plains Indians formed tribes of several thousand and lived in bands of a few hundred. They followed buffalo herds over wide areas. These weren't natural man primitives, okay? It's not your idea of like 16th and 17th century Native Americans using spears and this idea of this primitive lack of industrial tools type situation that you might think of when looking back hundreds of years before where we are now. These people used horses and guns, which were European imports, right? So many tribes were recently formed from much larger bands of people who had been reduced by disease and westward expansion. By treaty, these tribes owned large areas of land in the West, where they had been concentrated to make way for whites in the Great Lakes, the Ohio River Valley, and other eastern areas. The Cheyenne, for example, were given the area of the Colorado foothills between the North Platte and Arkansas rivers. For as long as waters run and the grass shall grow, the Sioux were given the Dakotas north of the Platte. Okay. And that was a quote from a treaty. For as long as waters run and the grass shall grow. But after the Civil War, these tribal lands were violated by the railroads. The railroads ate up large swaths of tribal land and sold it to settlers. In 1869, the year the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, President Ulysses S. Grant told Congress, quote, "The building of railroads is rapidly bringing civilized settlements into contact with all the tribes of Indians." National and state leaders knew this was in violation of treaties, but cared little. Right or wrong, General Tecumseh Sherman bluntly stated, those roads will be built, and everybody knows that Congress, after granting the charters, cannot now back out and surrender the country to a few bands of roving Indians. Sherman's solution to the problem was to fight it. 200 battles raged between Indians and U.S. soldiers in the decade after the Civil War. Sherman, who led the effort, insisted, quote, "We must fight the Indians and force them to collect in agreed-on limits far away from the continental roads." The Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876 wasn't Custer's last stand, as many people call it, so much as it was the last stand of the Plains Indians. By the early 1880s, the Indian Wars were over in terms of fighting and had moved into social and cultural reform. But the more fatal blow to Native American society was caused by the relentless settlement, development, and privatization of the land. The wanton slaughter of the buffalo in the 1860s and 70s destroyed the foundation of the Native American economy. White Americans turned their efforts to civilizing missions. Indian policy was not simply motivated by hate or racism, but by a civilizing mission that aimed to assimilate Indian peoples into American life. Now, don't misunderstand, racial attitudes are underlying in this motivation to assimilate. But the people who were attempting the assimilation and trying to get Native people to assimilate were not necessarily doing so out of malicious intent. The results were devastating, but people like Henry Dawes, who passed the who was the proponent of the Dawes Act, which we'll talk about in just a second, really was a true believer in the idea that assimilating Native Americans into mainstream white American culture would be beneficial to everyone. So forcing Indians to give up their migratory life for a sedentary life of farming was key to this civilizing mission. The Dawes Act of 1887 divided tribal lands into 160-acre units to encourage Indians to adopt farming. Those that did would be granted U.S. citizenship. Through the Dawes Act, 47 million acres were distributed to individual Indian families. But another 90 million acres of tribal lands left over after this process were sold to white settlers, with the profits going to schools to assimilate Indian children into American society. This was a kind of ethnic cleansing followed by destruction of culture, and that is why some Native Americans call it genocide. So speaking of schools, they would change Native children's hair to make it more white looking, cut their hair, change their clothes, teach them Christianity and English, and all that kind of stuff. So right now I want to show you an image of the outside of an Indian day school in the late 19th century. And that is going to be paired with Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce talking about Indian rights.
I have heard talk and talk, but nothing is done. Good words do not last long unless they amount to something. Words do not pay for my dead people. They do not pay for my country, now overrun by white men. Good words will not get my people a home where they can live in peace and take care of themselves. I am tired of talk that comes to nothing. It makes my heart sick when I remember all the broken promises.
One of the central questions that people tend to ask about this period is, did the Indians have any other choice than fighting? Well, warlike peoples such as the Cheyenne and the Sioux were winners of previous wars, and so some of them thought that perhaps they could win again. Did the American government have any other choices? Well, this is a great example of contingency in history. Nothing is inevitable. Indians might have adapted, for example, become cattle ranchers on the reservation as they had in Oklahoma if they had had more time to adapt. And just because the buffalo were eliminated, it did not necessarily mean that the Plains Indian culture would also be brought to an end. It is possible that the Indians could have adapted or switched to cattle. In 1874, Congress even passed a bill to protect the buffalo, but President Grant vetoed it, and he cited elimination of Native American peoples as one of the reasons for doing so. The old idea of Indian removal farther west won't work anymore because there's no place to put them. Americans have moved all the way out west. Instead, the government begins to adopt a peace policy. The American government now believes in the idea that it's cheaper to feed the Indians than to fight them. This also emerges out of the widespread criticism of massacres of Indians by militias in newspapers. Americans are tired of violence after the Civil War, and this peace policy is promoted by groups such as Friends of the Indian. Americans attempted to force Indians to adopt the dominant American culture and free labor norms. They turn Indians over to churches on the assumption that they'll be less corrupt, more efficient, and more concerned with their charges. None of this ends up being true. So Indians end up leaving reservations. They go back to the wars, and they're crushed. Indians eventually win more battles than they lose, but warriors were not soldiers. They were buffalo hunters and part-time soldiers. They could not compete with an industrial society that can produce limitless full-time military specialists. So one of the ironies of American history is that Indians have been better treated when ruled by the military and otherwise left alone to manage on their own, and manage their own economy and society, rather than on reservations run by Friends of the Indian. The peace policy, reservations, later the Dawes Act, were all promoted by Friends of the Indian. These things in fact harmed Indians the most because it destroyed their culture and economy. Sometimes the best intentions, often unexamined intentions, have the most harmful effects. This is a painting called American Progress. John Gast, a German immigrant, painted this in 1872. It is what we call a myth, a powerful story about the past that is really a story about the present and future. It matches well with Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis. In 1893, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner gave a celebrated lecture, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, in which he argued that on the western frontier, the distinctive qualities of American culture were forged: individual freedom, political democracy, and economic mobility. Turner's was one of the most influential interpretations of American history ever developed. While Turner described a process that may have been true before the Civil War, the post-Civil War West he actually lived in 1893, did not look like his thesis. People entered from the east and the south into the west. It wasn't free land, it was subsidized land, some of which had previously been inhabited by Native Americans. The government also played a key role in creating opportunity for corporations and for individuals. While Turner offered the idea that individuals tamed the land all on their own and came out in the West of their own accord, things like the Homestead Act and things like subsidized lands really paved the way for many of these people. So Turner offered only a partial account of Western history. Most settlers moved west in family groups or as members of immigrant communities, not as lone pioneers. Turner seemed to portray the West as an empty space before the coming of white settlers. Of course, it was already inhabited by Native Americans, whose dispossession was essential to the opening of land for settlement by others. Additionally, the West was hardly a uniform place of small, independent farmers. There was forced Indian labor in California. Landlords, railroads, and mining companies also utilized Mexican migrant and indentured laborers in the West, along with Chinese working on long-term contracts. After the Civil War, the West changed the United States in new ways. Confronting the Western territories forced the federal government to grow. It reshaped the U.S. military. And the scale and extent of public subsidy greatly favored private corporations. Most of all, it led to a new story about what it meant to be an American and who was American. So the next view of Buffalo is Buffalo and ecological consequences of expansion. The destruction of the buffalo leaves an ecological vacuum in the Great Plains. Cattle step in to fill that vacuum. The cattle's success is no more purely natural than buffalo's disappearance. Both are closely tied to the growth of the American economy and expansion of the railroads to the west. Texas Longhorn cattle were a very lean, fierce breed of cattle, which made them less than ideal for butchering. 9 pounds of hamburger on 900 pounds on the hoof, so it was very, very inefficient. But they were very hardy. They could travel long distances for water, had imposing horns which allowed them to defend themselves against wolves, and while large numbers died in winter, they generally survived without winter feedings. They were thus ideal animals for driving long distances over land. But Texas Longhorns carried a tick, which transmitted a disease called Texas fever. Longhorns could handle the disease from long exposure, but when animals were driven over land, They infected dairy cattle and wiped them out. In fact, Missouri banned Texas cattle drives in 1851 and again in 1861. So cattle towns had to be far west of populated areas. The railroad fit these needs perfectly. Abilene, Kansas in 1867 was the first of the cow towns. The 1880s were the apex of the cattle boom. Europeans invested in western herds. Cheap businesses provided low wages for cowboys. Calves were cheap, free grass, right, all over the plains. There were high returns from mature cattle, so it was a cheap business to run and grow. The cattle boom seriously overstocked the range. By the mid-1880s, there were about 7.5 million cattle on the Great Plains, which compare that to the buffalo numbers we talked about earlier. This was both economic overproduction and ecologically unsustainable. It was a disaster waiting to happen. And the cold winters of 1885 to 1886 provided the immediate cause. From a third to half of the cattle died in each of those winters. Economic disaster worsened because cattlemen rushed to sell their surviving cattle in 1887 to make up for their losses. This pushed down the price further. These ecological disasters led to a rise of conservationist thinking. This disaster was neither an accident or bad luck. It would be repeated elsewhere with livestock in the arid Great Basin that lies between the Rockies and the Sierras and Cascades. These disasters illustrate a basic pattern in the West. Overuse of natural resources that seem limitless, but turn out to be quite fragile. Wasteful, unregulated, uncontrolled markets in which these resources were wasted. This pattern was found in grazing, and as we have seen, in mining, in fishing, in logging, with wildlife. In other words, the things that we think of as Western, mountains, grasslands, forests, rivers, and wildlife, were literally consumed by a voracious American economy in the late 19th century. So the destruction of Western resources forces some in the government and in industry to call for greater governmental control over the Western lands. Eventually, this will bear fruit in two things. First, the U.S. government stops selling the land and decides to keep managing it forever, and the government takes a regulatory role in managing natural resources like forests, rivers, grasslands, and mountains. This larger government was forced to grow by the West. So buffalo are a way to look at how things are happening in the West and see how they are actually very connected to what's going on in the rest of the U.S. I'm going to use the buffalo to continue this discussion of the West and link it to the rest of the country. So lastly, Buffalo Bill and the emergence of mass popular culture. Buffalo Bill is an example of how incredibly mixed up mythical representations of the West and the reality of the West were. He gets his nickname hunting buffalo for the railroad. Buffalo Bill was actually on the stage in Delaware when news was received that war had broken out with the Lakota. He stepped to the edge of the stage and said that he had to leave to go west as a scout for the army. He vowed to take the first scalp in revenge for Custer. So as a scout, Buffalo Bill dressed in a Mexican vaquero's showman's costume. He wore it so that he could later say that this was the exact costume I was wearing when I took the scalp for Custer. Buffalo Bill quit the cavalry later and toured the nation showing off the scalp and reenacting the battle. He killed Yellow Hand and took the scalp from him. Buffalo Bill then organizes the Wild West show. He recruits the actual Indians that he had fought, including Sitting Bull, and brings them into the show to reenact battles that they had fought against whites. This has connections to immigrants to the United States. Soldiers who fought with Custer were largely immigrants, and the people who came to watch his Wild West shows were also largely immigrants. Buffalo Bill was telling Western stories. So just like John Gass' painting or Turner's frontier thesis, Buffalo Bill's shows continued to mythologize and romanticize the West. Mass culture is also emerging in the late 19th century where stories can be dispersed very quickly and easily. People far from the West are made to feel part of the story, and the West is claimed in that sense. Frederick Jackson Turner and Buffalo Bill are both telling stories about their times. Sometimes these stories overlap or even compete. That is the essence of historical interpretation. Figuring out which stories make the best sense of a time is our job. Many of these older tropes or storylines remain with us. There is a direct link between Buffalo Bill's stories and the Western movies, and between the Western movies and our present ideas about the West and about frontiers generally. So we have talked about the South and the West after the Civil War. I have shown how the market, the economy, was transforming areas of the nation far from its population centers. What had once been distinct regions, even isolated hinterlands, now became integrated into American life through the market, through the railroad, and through an expanding government. These areas were also being connected by the movement of people. Immigrants from overseas and migrants from the older parts of the U.S. poured into the West and moved about in the South. This expansion had consequences for everyone, for the people already in the West, for the newcomers, and for the land itself. So next time we will talk about the cities and who was eating that Western beef, building with the wood from Western forests, and making steel from Western ore.